Hey, okay, looks like we're live on YouTube now.
Awesome.
Welcome, Dennison. Yes, I guess welcome to the Arweave Ecosystem and Community Hangout call. We're very, very, very glad to have you here.
Excellent. I am happy to be here too.
Okay, so to give everyone a bit of background on what we're doing here and kind of why we got together for this call in the first place, I suppose we should introduce the Dapphero profit sharing community project. So do you want to maybe give some kind of background on how we got to this point, do you think?
Yeah, so Dapphero was a project that I had built along with my co-founder. Unfortunately, we were shutting down the project, and at the end of the year, we will be officially turning off the servers for it. But the project is open source, and it's actually in the public domain, the code that we had written. And there have been a number of different parties who've been interested in working on building on it going forward. And Arweave and Sam had reached out about talking about building a profit-sharing community. So that's one of the ideas that's being talked about for the future of Dapphero. I thought it was a really great idea. To be clear, it's not a Dapphero project going forward. This would be something that's built entirely by the community without our participation or involvement or even profit. Like, this is entirely a separate thing that's community run. But I was interested in participating in letting people know what it is, the story behind it. So there is a sense of like continuation through the different groups that are interested in building on top of it. So I wanted to sort of like introduce it and shepherd it forward so that others feel empowered to build their own things on top of it, build their own things with it.
Yeah, so I think this idea of, I mean, it's a fantastic thing to do. We thank you for basically contributing to the open source ecosystem. But it reminds me of the way that these startup closing or ramping down processes have sort of evolved over the years. And I think what we're talking about here could be like the third major evolution of that. So at the beginning, it was just like you had your like Web 2 startup, and if you decided to move on to something new, then you would essentially just get to this point where you offboarded your users. And like at the beginning, it was just like people just turned off the servers. But then there was this movement towards like, okay, how about let's try and help people get their data out. And that was like the first major evolution of it. And then the second one was like, what if we can try and make the code open source? And that's pretty exciting. And I think where we're getting to here is like, what if the code is open source, and then there's also a push to create a sort of self-sustaining community, a profit-sharing community in this case, around that code, so that people have the appropriate incentives to keep building. And it really becomes like its own project that's away from the founders, and it becomes its own thing. And one of the interesting things you and I have been discussing is how, so we're planning to co-sponsor this bounty to move Dapphero, or not move, but create a new Dapphero if you want, as a profit-sharing community. And one of the things is like giving away the ownership tokens in that community, or at least a large portion of them, to users of Dapphero today. I think that could be like it's an amazing thing to do, to essentially like spin up something new and give the community ownership of it itself. It's a whole different way of handling this, I guess, this moving on process, while also just not breaking people's trust. Like when people trust startups to build applications or to run applications for them, it's a bit of a breach of trust when one day they just shut it down.
Yeah, so that was really heavy on my mind, right? And but before I get into sort of the thought processes behind it, just to sort of like clarify, going forward, Dapphero, the actual company, myself, my former co-founder, the team, we don't have anything to do with the profit sharing community or whatever sort of like incentive models sort of like built around that. So this is an entirely new beast. But that we are excited to see happen, because as you mentioned, there is kind of this sense of a breach of trust when a Web 2 project kind of shuts down, right? You used it one day, you loved it, and suddenly it's gone. And when we had to make the difficult decision to shut down Dapphero, the software, we were really struck with this question of like, okay, well, what happens to the people who do use it, right? Because it costs money to run, and one of the things that we found was that it wasn't necessarily like really a business in the form that we were confident that we could take forward, right? So for us, it was just like, okay, well, there's a necessity to move on. The company itself has pivoted to something else, which we'll get into at a later time. And the idea was like, okay, so how do people, have a sense of continuity? How do people like continue to move forward with it? How do people bring about like all these different possibilities that, I'd really fallen in love with when it was created in the first place? So, I had sent out, a tweet a few weeks back saying, hey, reach out if you're interested in being the part of the future of like whatever Dapphero might be. And, you, Sam, and Arweave are one of the several groups that reached out to talk about this. And I'm excited to help anyone who's interested in building on top of the code base and trying to build a future for it, right? There was a lot of things that I had always wanted to get to, but we never had a chance to get to. And so I'm excited to see that out in the world. Yeah,
for sure. Yeah, so I think we should definitely get to some of those, like, I guess, places you guys didn't get to with Dapphero V1. Non-community version, company version, if you want, a little bit later. But maybe it makes sense at this point if we just kind of like introduce what were your motivations for building Dapphero in the first place? What does it do as a service? Who uses it? How is it used? And then we can get to like, what you would have built on top of it if you had time, that kind of thing.
Yeah, so it was really built in the beginning last Thanksgiving. So actually a year ago, I was just struggling with the process of like how hard it was to build front ends for projects. It's like you had to use React, you had to know JavaScript and Web3, and I knew these things, but even as like a developer myself, the process of just starting and building something using on top of Ethereum was really just too hard, right? It was a long process. There's a lot of like lines of code that were necessary. Web3 was really, persnickety at the time. So it felt generally frustrating if I wanted to just have something really easy to use. There were a few tools out there that I really liked. One-Click Dapp, I have to give a big shout out to them. They were always really inspirational to the ideas behind Dapphero originally. But I wanted something where I could actually build a custom front end using it on my own, just using HTML. So that's right where Dapphero really came from. And a big part of our sort of like business idea was, hey, this is going to be a tool that's awesome for hackathons. At the time, there were a large number of short-term hackathons of like 2 or 3 days where, people were really trying to build something fast and get something out of the door fast, right? And what we're finding is that, I previously worked at Open Zeppelin as developer advocate. What we would find is that in a 3-day hackathon that starts on Friday, ends on Sunday, generally it would be like late Saturday night when people had just finally figured out how to use Web3. And maybe they had built some sort of really incredible smart contract system, but they spent all their time sort of learning the not blockchain part of the hackathon, which was just like, how do I connect my front end to it? Which, you could argue is definitely very important, but it wasn't exactly like part of what the core of these hackathons felt like they were for. So, Dapphero is really like, hey, let's build this tool for hackathons where people can focus on their idea and they don't have to first, I used to have this line of, don't build the thing you need to build to be able to build the thing you're trying to build, where you could just build the thing that you were trying to build and just move forward with that.
Yeah.
So for Dapphero was really built for that. And we had great success at the early hackathons at ETH Denver, at ETH London. But then, of course, coronavirus came and it kind of killed the hackathon category in the 3-day set, right? Like ETH Global continues, of course, to have hackathons, but they're a very different model. They're a month long. And that model actually changes things significantly, right? Like, so if you're doing a 3-day hackathon, it's more about really learning blockchain and applying blockchain to problems that you're solving. But month-long hackathons, really, they're more of this opportunity to learn the entire stack of blockchain, right? So you can imagine that if you're coming into blockchain as just maybe a novice JavaScript programmer, a month is really enough time for you to learn the whole stack, learn React, learn the Web3, learn the Solidity, learn the deployment, and build a whole product out there. And actually, I think that's probably more of the goal for these longer hackathons. So what we found was that the Dapphero wasn't really an ideal candidate for that type of situation. And in many cases, the market's just too early for a product like Dapphero currently, right? We are sort of it was really built on this idea that there's this large number of like professional developers out there who don't know necessarily React or don't necessarily know JavaScript. And, Dapphero would also let them build using PHP or Go or whatever they were using to like, generate their HTML. But that market, just doesn't exist right now. And in a large part with Ethereum, because Dapphero was very Ethereum focused, what we saw was sort of like the Venn diagram of Dapphero users and the Venn diagram of like DeFi developers really sort of started to like pull apart over time. And towards the end, we didn't really see that much of an overlap between these type of users. We made the decision, of course, to move on and pivot for business reasons. But I still see Dapphero as, the concept, right, as being really something that's important for users to think about in the Web3 community, right? Like, I'm pretty sure that once others start like picking apart Dapphero, they'll probably rewrite the code base from scratch. We wrote it several times, and there were design decisions that we made in the beginning that definitely came back to bite us, and anyone who wants to build on it going forward is going to have to contend with. But I think it's really probably the most important part of it is just the architecture idea, right? How can we let people build dApps using just HTML? Right? Like, why should they need to know React? Like, the ecosystem tends to be a little bit over React focused. Why do we need to sort of force people to do that? You should be able to interact with blockchain using PHP if you wanted to, right? Like, you certainly can interact with any sort of database technology using PHP, with any sort of API using PHP. It's very weird that you can't build something that supports Ethereum using PHP, right? So the sort of idea behind it, like, and to get in a little bit with the architecture, the way it really worked was we would have a script that runs at the bottom of your HTML, and basically it watches your DOM, and it looks for these HTML5 tags in your DOM, and when it sees them, it substitutes the inner HTML or the inner text of the element with whatever data that you were sort of like trying to get from the blockchain itself. We built it using React. I think if I was still working on Dapphero now, I would probably just rebuild it in pure JavaScript, or maybe even something like jQuery. But at the time we were moving fast, trying to see if there was a market fit, and there wasn't at the time. So I mean, I don't know how that bodes forward for people trying to build profit-sharing communities. I think there's certainly an opportunity going forward, especially when you look at all the different things that are out there. But I think you would really need to think about like, okay, what Dapphero sort of offering is this abstraction on Web3, right? Like it's bundling up the experience of interacting with smart contracts and really requiring you to just use tags, right? Like, just tag your elements. So going forward, I think, if I were to throw out ideas, like what people might want to be doing is they would probably wanting to think about how do they integrate like distributed storage solutions, how they integrate like distributed identity solutions, how this could be built into other products. One of the things that I'm really interested in seeing is a plugin for Remix, where just like there's a one-click dApp plugin for Remix, there would be a Dapphero plugin for Remix. And to be clear, when I use Dapphero right now, I'm sort of using Dapphero to sort of like capture this category of abstraction rather than the company, which will be no more, and the product, which will be no more. But I would love to see a Remix plugin where you just you code. Remix is such a powerful tool in the ecosystem, especially for people outside the space. And I can't sort of like emphasize that enough, but an experience where you create your smart contract, you deploy your smart contract, and then you can deploy your Dapphero dApp using Dapphero. I mean, there's also one-click dApp, which again I'll plug them. But in this case, you would be able to like alter your HTML, and maybe there's a future even where people have HTML editors in Remix, right? For example. So there's all sorts of things that I had always thought about, and my former co-founder Drake Evans, we had always thought about. But we we hope to see other people build them.
I think there's a huge scope for expansion here. I remember seeing a video of introducing Dapphero. You were at ETH Denver, or is it ETH Paris maybe?
Both.
Right. But then I saw this video and I was like, oh wow, this is awesome. This is like the most easily accessible way to build smart contract systems. Now that's really exciting in and of itself. I mean, for the profit sharing community, like it'll be down to the founders and the community that end up owning the tokens. But I think like the obvious thing is like, hey, let's cater for the people that are using, old Dapphero v1 first. Like, let's make sure that they get continuity and there's no breach of like, what they were expecting. Like that's something that's easily achievable. And I think maybe you could tell us a little bit about like who's using Dapphero, that kind of stuff.
Yeah. So. For one of the challenges that will exist for people who want to build new things on top of Dapphero's code base or reinvent the code base is, we did something that's probably kind of faux pas in this community, which is we use the no-code tool to actually power the Dapphero backend. And that was really a decision that we made at the time out of sort of just necessity and speed. We're a small, scruffy team. We wanted to move fast. We actually built the very first version that we launched at ETH Denver in maybe about 4 weeks, like really just like crazy speed. And so for that, we actually built the back end and the front end all on this service called bubble.io. And I will plug them here because it's pretty incredible software. Like there are some caveats that you want to take into mind if you want something that's necessarily super performant or portable. In this case, it's not portable. There's real vendor lock-in when using no-code platforms. Yeah. That wasn't a concern at the time, but it's not cheap to run. That's one of the sort of like thought considerations that went into the future of where we wanted to go with it. But I forgot the question.
Okay, who is using Dapphero and how are they using it?
So we actually don't know how people are using it. We always had envisioned some sort of like analytics layer to this, but we never got around to that. So we generally, we could probably peek into what people are trying to build and where, but we actually never built that. So in general, we don't know. I would give a shout out, like during the hackathons, we saw some really exciting projects that people did build with Dapphero. And one that I absolutely always loved was CO Token. It was the coolest project that I'd ever seen. Basically what it was they were using Dapphero to power their front end for their carbon credit system. And what the carbon credit system was they were actually, it was a library or whatever in Solidity that would actually calculate the carbon emission cost of running your smart contract and allow your smart contract to offset its own carbon emissions, which for me was just like, it was a phenomenal idea. I think they were a winner at the Blockchain for Social Impact Incubator competition as well, which is backed by Microsoft and a number of others. So that was probably really the coolest thing. I think one of the other sort of like stories that really sticks to me really, really strongly is at ETH London, there was this group of college students, I forget where, maybe like MIT or Dartmouth, something like that. And they had this funny real world problem, which was when they were at class, they had iPads or some sort of Chromebook. They had these really underpowered computing devices, and they wanted to not pay attention in class and just play video games. But their hardware wasn't powerful enough. So what they built was they used a blockchain power system using DAI and Dapphero for the interface, where you could basically rent the compute power of your friend's PC in his or her dorm room so that you could play high-powered games on your local underpowered device on campus in class. So that was all, and they were really a great example of like the kind of people that were coming to Dapphero at the time. They had never built on blockchain before. They had this idea. They would figure out the Solidity code, and they didn't want to, they had a large enough task in front of them in the first place. And so what they wanted to do was they wanted to just build. They just wanted to build their thing. They didn't want to have to worry about like dealing with Web3 and React and stuff like that. So they built it using Dapphero, and that was pretty amazing. Today, I think it's a lot of like early people who are experimenting, who are trying to understand how to like just start playing with Ethereum. I was always really a big proponent of how do we give people this like first love of Ethereum, like this sense of success right at the start, right? And requiring people to learn React and hooks and Web3 and interact with wallets really just puts a barrier between that first moment someone writes a smart contract and that first moment that they like see that they can do something special with it.
It's like time to wow,
time to wow. It was really about reducing time to wow. And I think it really did a great job at it at the time, right? I think even though it's only been a year, that's of course like 2 decades in blockchain world.
Right.
The Ethereum network looks very different today. The Ethereum user, the average Ethereum user looks very different. And I think we would have always had, if we were continuing with it, we were always going to have to confront the question of what the future would look like, right? When gas prices, one of the things we saw is that as gas prices went up, users just went off a cliff, right? Wow. And that's a big deal because if you have people starting out and they're building something on Ropsten and it's cool and all that, and then there was this point, maybe a month or two ago, when gas prices were really high, where we had this one demo where you could like create a NFT wallet or the ERC20 wallet. Yeah. And you deploy it on Ropsten, it's really easy. And then it was just like, okay, now deploy it on mainnet and you really have your own NFT or you really have your own ERC20, right? And at the time it cost over $700 to deploy an ERC 721 contract.
Wow.
So,
wow, that's incredible. Okay, yeah.
It went from, it just became a different thing. And I personally have a lot of thoughts on like where the sort of like, Ethereum network is going to go. But, we really see DeFi as becoming the killer app for Ethereum, right? And Dapphero was never conceived in my mind as a DeFi tool, right? It was always like a developer tool. And, for anyone who's looking to build a profit sharing community or something on top of it, dev tooling is very hard to make money in. So good luck to you.
Interesting.
But, there were always people who were interested in it.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I think in terms of the dev tooling and making money as a profit sharing community, one of the things we're actually really excited about in terms of profit sharing communities is the idea of being able to serve the long tail of applications that aren't like super high growth, right? You should just be able to build something in your spare time and have it be like a profit generating and sharing, entity, I suppose, or an application without everything having to be like, like a hyper-growth startup or nothing. I think there's a long tail there that isn't served well by the existing like company structures. So that's definitely something we're really excited about. And in terms of scalability and DeFi and Ethereum, this is a fascinating conversation. And it's too long to get into, but just quickly, what's your thoughts on like Ethereum 2 and the composability changes? Because, sorry, go on.
I honestly have not been keeping up with ETH2. I used to, and then
got it.
It's too much. I have no comment. I have no idea. I've said so many silly things about my opinion on that, but I'm the day it arrives will be the day I'm thankful. I am saving my 32 ETH to be a validator.
Awesome.
How this works in the future, I don't know.
Yeah. Okay.
But I did actually wanted to comment though on your earlier comment on like these non-startup business models, right? Like Dapphero, the company was a startup and needs to sort of be a startup, right? Like, and what we built in the end isn't really a startup, right?
Right.
But we do need to remember that not everything has to be a hyper-growth business, right? Like, of course, we have investors, so we have an obligation to like think of like a hyper-growth business, and hopefully the thing that we pivoted to will be a hyper-growth business. But there should be space in the world for things that are businesses, but not hyper-growth businesses, right? And the problem I think sometimes we see with software is, or at least the software that sort of like hits the sort of like, the front page of the news, it's always got to be like hyper growth, right? Like, and it's got to like support this, it's got to return this and all this. And there is a lot of software in the world that doesn't do that, right? But it's still really valuable. I mean, if you look at like the NPM library for Node, tons of software doesn't make any money, yet people work on it and they improve it, right? And what I think is really exciting about this idea that you were talking about, the profit sharing community, is that if you look at like GitHub, right, and Microsoft has tried to like incentivize like donations to open source, right, and like nobody donates to open source, right? Like, there was something about, I remember reading something, and internet, if I'm wrong about it. Maybe I'm just repeating rumor, but there was this moment where for the amount that Microsoft paid to purchase GitHub, I think like at the time, and this is where I'm definitely going to be wrong, but I think like all-time donations to GitHub projects were like 13 million, and maybe I'm totally wrong on that. But it was some really small number, and it was like the amount of money that they paid for GitHub, they could have like paid for all of open source ever, right? Like they could have just like funded everything, and that stuff goes unfunded, right? And sometimes you'll see when you're doing like npm install or yarn, whatever, you'll see at the end of your install log, someone will be like, hey, this is Rick. I made this in my spare time. I'm looking for a job. If this helps you out, please hire me or consider donating to it, right? And sometimes, I assume most of these people aren't getting donated to. Hopefully they're getting hired. But sometimes you see this when you're installing like Web3, right? Like
big stuff. Yeah, I know, it's crazy.
Big stuff. Right, some people are out there building empires off of the work of some like dude or dudette somewhere, or dudette or otherwise, somewhere working hard in their free time to maintain some little brick in the wall that happens to be like, this is cryptography, just the little brick, the tiny little piece, and they don't get anything for it, right? So the idea that maybe you could turn that brick into a community, and maybe it doesn't make millions of dollars, maybe it doesn't make hundreds of thousands of dollars, right? Maybe it just says, hey, person working on this in your free time, we acknowledge you, we acknowledge your efforts, we thank you for contributing, and even though maybe this profit sharing community has earned $50, here's your share of that $50, right? And sometimes, like, if people are doing this already just because they believe, well, it would be nice for them to also be able to do things in a community that believes together, right? And if they figure out how to make a business out of it, fine. But Dapphero is one of those things that I can imagine the code base. I imagine it's going to be totally different. Please, internet, do not judge me when you read the code. Do not judge me. We were working very fast. I imagine maybe one day there'll be like Dapphero, retreats where they get like a farm in upstate New York, and like 20 people show up and they're like, hey, how do we support the latest like HTML this or something like that, and that I hope to see people build versions of it, for Polkadot, for Arweave, for Cosmos, for everything, right? Like the idea is you shouldn't have to be this expert in JavaScript and React and front-end development to be able to use blockchain. Because if you are, then you're just limiting the potential uses of this technology to such a narrow group. But really, this is, like something like 33% of the internet is run on WordPress. 33% of the entire internet is run on WordPress, right? And it should not be rocket science to be able to use blockchain and WordPress, right? It shouldn't be. Even though I understand that WordPress isn't sexy, you should just be able to use it.
But it shows the market for low or no code solutions on the web.
Yeah, and of course, something that investors pointed out was like, yes, maybe 33% of the internet is run on WordPress, but probably 99% of the value that goes over the internet runs on React. Fair enough, totally legit. But
I think probably not React, right? Like Amazon, for example, they just use some crappy 1990s thing they've thrown together. Like it's still basically the same interface. But
I think I know like Amazon's huge, so it's not really possible to generalize them.
Yeah.
But they do some significant portion of the part that consumers interact with does run on something like React, a version of React.
Interesting.
I mean, internet, fry me alive for that if I'm wrong, but I have friends who work at Amazon as front-end developers, and they do React.
Okay, interesting, cool. Yeah, I mean, that begs another question, which kind of links to what you were speaking about previously with people using open source code and then making a killing from it without rewarding the original developers. So that's basically Amazon's cloud services business model. But I don't think we have time to go into that. Speaking of startups, maybe you can tell us a little bit about your new venture and how that's going.
Yeah, so one of the things that I had also been interested in always was governance. I was interested in governance while early on, where I built this hackathon project once, and part of like the process was thinking about how it's supposed to run. I remember at one of, I think it was maybe like ETH Buenos Aires, where you went to the bathroom and there was some sort of like funny quote about how if your contract has like only owner, you were like somehow, I forget what it was, but there's something around, it's not really like decentralized, right? And I really got into my head about like governance, and we see so much happening around how governance is supposed to work, right? There's some things that happen along the way that were sort of like pivotal for me, like the sort of like problem with like Ether Delta, when are distributed things actually distributed? There's that idea of like walks like a duck, talks like a duck. It is a duck. So you build the decentralized system, and then there's an only owner, and the only owner is you. Well, suddenly the law is like, well, it doesn't look decentralized to us because you control all the money, right? And we see that a lot, and we saw that for a lot of different projects out there, and governance had always been something I've been interested in, and I've been really impressed with what Compound had done for governance. And I sort of started experimenting with governance dashboards back in like May or so, and then was really looking at like, Compound put out like all this great documentation about how to build governance dashboards, right? And they were really talking about like people build governance dashboards, and of course a lot of people have thought of this. So we are building a new, it's a new team. This is sort of our new project, and we are building something called Tally. And the sort of like total name we're still sort of like working out, but it's like Tally. And what we are building basically is the tools around enabling communities to participate better in governance. Because one of the things you see is that you have a lot of governance out there, but not many people take part in it. Right. And they don't take part in it for a lot of different reasons. One of them is that it's complicated, right? And it's difficult to understand what it's around and what it's for. Now, there have been a few things that have launched since we pivoted, which have made the field even more competitive and exciting. Number one being, of course, Snapshot. And Snapshot really speaks, I think, to how governance is a community act, right? And how even just signaling is important, right? And that's something, that really also interested me when you said, hey, I want to try this Dapphero profit sharing community idea. This idea of like people running things themselves. Well, they need the tools to be able to do that. Otherwise, it's just it's like otherwise it's not real, right? Like if people don't have this. So anyway, we're building the tools for that. We are still kind of in stealth mode, although we have an incredible team member, Nate Parton, who's been writing just an amazing newsletter that if you're not following the Tally newsletter, you absolutely should. I know that I'm like trying to build a governance product, and I'm overwhelmed by all the stuff happening in the governance ecosystem every week. And Nate really just like boils it down in the newsletter to like the TLDR of the past week in governance. So it's just a fantastic resource. So definitely subscribe to that. I'm not sure if I can like post a link to it somewhere, but I will try and post it.
Marine can help us with that. But yeah, we'll make sure that it's distributed.
Yeah. But yeah, that's what we're working on now.
That's really awesome. Yeah, I can definitely second how amazing the Tally newsletter is. I've been reading the last couple of weeks. It's really helpful. Obviously, governance is something that's super interesting to us because of profit sharing communities. So we're watching the space very, very carefully. Yeah, amazing. Okay, well, thank you so much for giving us like the introduction to Dapphero, kind of part of the story, and also Tally. Where can people find you on the web if they want to catch up or reach out to you later?
So you can always find me on Instagram. So that's Dennison Bertram. Oh, sorry, not Instagram. Well, I'm on Instagram too, but I don't really use it. So on Twitter.
Twitter. Okay, there we go.
Twitter. I'm Dennison Bertram on Twitter. If you have another idea, like the profit sharing community idea is just one idea that people are looking at for using Dapphero. If you want to do something else with it separate, you are more than welcome. The code that we wrote is public domain. The rest of it's open source because, of course, we didn't write React and JavaScript and stuff like that.
Right.
But anyone is welcome to build on it. We really hope that lots of people do build on it. And we, currently it's not decentralized. We never got to the point where it was decentralized. Which is, I think, one of the reasons why we started speaking in the first place, because I was like, hey, it would be great if like people could host on Arweave, because, come December when we turn off Dapphero, it's turning off the lights. The lights are out, right?
Yeah,
it's like the Borg cube and you got the queen, and now the whole hive is down. So it would be great if people could, find ways to keep their projects alive and keep moving.
Okay, amazing. Well, thanks for taking the time to chat to us. I'm super excited to see where the joint bounty goes. Maybe we catch up at some point later to see how things are going with Tally.
Yep, absolutely. Will do.
Perfect. Thanks, everyone. Catch you later.
Thank you.